right, welcome. I'm delighted to welcome you today to the first webinar in a new series on building bridges for sustainable change. Today, we'll explore the interplay between environmental, social, and governance, known as ESG, and the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. The webinar series is aimed at providing a forum for stakeholders within investment markets, corporates, United Nations, academia, and civil society to discuss the current state of play in the implementation and delivery of the 2030 SDG agenda, but also bring to the forefront any pain points where stronger collaboration can deliver a meaningful impact. In today's webinar specifically, you'll hear from sustainability experts working in investment markets, United Nations, and civil society as they provide clarity on a number of questions surrounding sustainability. But before we kick off, I would like to provide a brief introduction to all of the speakers. So my name is Lydia Schreiber. I'm an investment expert with expertise on sustainability, and I'm a trustee on the board of the One World Trust, who's co-sponsoring the webinar series in collaboration with Action for Sustainable Development. I'll serve as the moderator throughout the series. On the panel today, we're fortunate to have Friedrich Soltau, Chief in the Office of Intergovernmental Support and Coordination for Sustainable Development at UNDESA, a key advocate and leader in SDG implementation. We're also joined by Henry Boucher, Head of Investment Strategy Group at Saracen Partners, a firm with a thematic investment approach underpinned by sustainability, as well as Ollie Henman, a global coordinator at Action for Sustainable Development, a global platform supporting 3,000 organizations and activists for the delivery of the SDGs. So welcome to all of our panelists. And with that, I'd like to kick it off with the first question, which I would like to address to Henry. Now, when we think about the investment community, the framework for solving for ESG has become a major part of building more impact-focused portfolios. Now, for the audience members who are less familiar with sustainable investing, can you provide a brief overview of how a fund might take into account ESG when selecting investments?
Sure. I suppose the best thing to do is to start where everyone does have knowledge. I mean, traditionally, it's been the financial results that are the most material aspect to investors, and the external impacts that a company may have on the environment and on society have been largely, if you like, out of sight and out of mind. And so with sustainability, and indeed this is really a societal driver from concern around climate change, there are more and more people who would like their investments not only to be run thinking about financial factors, but also taking into account those environmental and social factors. So many investment funds have been responding to this increased demand for ESG over the last few years by thinking about, say, carbon emissions or other pollutants. And over time, I suppose what we've seen is just a gradual awakening to the fact that the materiality is not just financial. It's a double materiality, if you like, where you think not only about the bottom line financial results, but you also think about the impact that the company may have on people and planet. And that's really where sustainable investing is coming from.
Thank you, Henry. So I think, when we think about sustainable investing and the SDGs, it's become quite a pivotal part of sustainability in general. So I think it probably makes sense now to turn it over to Friedrich. Friedrich, can you provide a bit of an introduction to how those 2030 UN SDGs were developed?
Thank you very much, Lydia, and good day, colleagues and participants. The SDGs really came about following what was a major innovation with the Millennium Development Goals, which put the poverty eradication message fully on the radar and Those goals came to a conclusion in 2015. And before that, member states started thinking, what can we do to take this goals-driven framework with targets, with measurement, with data, and put that more broadly across the sustainable development spectrum? Because while the MDGs address poverty and social issues, so health, maternal mortality, the other dimensions such as the environment and the economy were not really part of that framework. So with the SDGs, the idea came, governments sat down and began to negotiate and came to the conclusion with 17 goals, which are really the spectrum of the social issues, health, poverty eradication, as well as environmental issues, biodiversity, the ocean, as well as economic issues. And we see there the interest from some developing countries largely about infrastructure, about innovation, making that part of the sustainability agenda. And those goals were adopted in 2015, and they're sort of the core of this 2030 agenda, which is an overarching framework, a political declaration in the General Assembly, which has a few key principles, and I'll mention one, which is on leaving no one behind. The idea that as we implement the goals, as we deliver on this agenda, we should really look also to make sure that those who are hard to reach, rural persons living in rural areas, vulnerable groups, marginalized groups, that our efforts at implementation also reach out to them. Because that was one of the critiques of the Millennium Development Goals, that we sort of said, okay, we met the target on aggregate, but we didn't look and see what were the hardest to reach pockets of poverty or deprivation. And this agenda also tries to do that. And the last point I want to make, which is super important, is that this agenda really applies to all countries. The MDGs were really about poverty, so largely aimed at developing countries, whereas the SDGs are for all countries, universal, applying as much to the UK, to the US, as they do to Mali or South Africa or Indonesia. So every single country has work to do on the SDGs, although some of them, of course, are more advanced on some goals. And perhaps the final point I would like to say is that very important, I think, for this audience and this idea is that sustainability has been there for a long time. We've talked about sustainable development for many years, but it's been a bit abstract. But moving to the SDGs, we have the 17 goals, the 169 targets, and a set of indicators, so we can have something to hold on to, whether you're working in the water sector, whether you're working in the IT sector. There's a target that you can align with and look at, and the indicators behind that with which we can measure progress. So for purpose of communication to broader audiences outside what we call the New York bubble of governments and stakeholders which are really invested in this, to a broader audience, I think that's one of the major innovations, that the SDGs speak much more intuitively to a broader set of stakeholders. Thank you.
Thank you, Friedrich. So it's interesting because when we talk about the 169 targets and the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, which apply on a global basis, I think civil society plays an important part. And Ollie, I think given that your platform is targeting civil societies across 155 countries, I think it would be interesting to hear your thoughts on how civil society contributes to the monitoring of these SDGs.
Thanks so much, Lydia. It's great to be here, and it's really amazing that we managed to bring together these diverse parts of civil society and with those of you involved with investment and thinking about different ways of measuring the SDGs. So we really welcome this discussion, and we look forward to the further discussions over the coming months. So first of all, just to give you a little bit of background from our point of view, to complement what we've already heard from the UN, from Friedrich Soltau, the civil society engagement also goes back even before 2015. There had been active campaigns and engagement under the previous round on the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs. And there was quite a big campaign that some people remember called Make Poverty History around about 2005 until 2010, which really aimed to tackle some of those underlying inequalities and to focus on a more effective development assistance around the world. With the SDGs, as Friedrich has already highlighted, the emphasis widened. So it's not just about development assistance, but rather it's a universal agenda that includes climate, includes environmental protections, as well as those social dimensions and economic dimensions. And I think as Friedrich has highlighted, that's really essential and really at the heart of what we're talking about here, that you cannot solve the economic side without also looking at the social and environmental dimensions. And it's really seen as a kind of holistic agenda. So from our point of view, we began as a campaign in 2015 that really aimed to galvanize and bring forward voices from communities around the world who wanted to be part of that dialogue and that negotiation that was happening in 2015. And many of the groups that we work with are themselves coalitions or networks at the national level. A good example is one called the SDGs Kenya Forum, which is a network of civil society groups in Kenya. In Brazil, they have what they call the 2030 Working Group, which is, again, a network of many different groups, whether they're working with women's rights, with youth voices, with indigenous peoples, with persons with disabilities. They aim to try to connect across different parts of society in each of those countries that are looking at the delivery of the SDGs. In India, there's also a very strong network which is called Wadanatolo Abhiyan. So that's it means to keep the promise. And again, that's a network that has its own dialogue with the government in India, as well as engaging with key UN meetings. So we see across the world civil society networks engaging with their governments, holding them accountable for what was agreed in 2015, but also then bringing those voices into the UN process. And we work closely with a kind of formal structure that exists at the UN, which is called the Major Groups and Other Stakeholders, which is a kind of a channel, a way, if you like, to bring those community voices into the UN discussions. And as some of you will know, every year about 40 countries review their progress on the SDGs in what they call the voluntary national reviews. And we help to support civil society coalitions at the country level who would like to engage on those discussions on the voluntary national reviews, who might want to then raise an independent voice and a different point of view on delivery in their countries. They might present that as an independent report that goes to their government, but also they have the opportunity, thanks to UNDESA and to the agreement that was put in place in 2015, they have the opportunity to raise some of those key points at the UN as well. And there's always a 2-minute spot for stakeholders to come forward and highlight some of their ideas, questions and concerns that they might have on each of those countries that present their reports. So we help them to do that. And a lot of the work we do is around the capacity development, training, awareness raising, and helping to build those stronger networks so that the voices of all different parts of society can be heard in this really important agenda. Thanks, and back to you, Lydia.
Thanks, Ollie. So you've talked about some of the framework that's in place and some of the processes that civil society organizations, kind of apply in order to get the message and to measure the SDGs and the progress towards that. If we circle back to the investment community and corporates, and if I turn back to Henry, what guiding principles or regulation are really driving the framework on a global basis to help companies and investors make decisions that are more aligned with the UN SDGs?
Well, I wish there was a single simple answer to that question. I think just listening to Ollie and the amazing work that's being done, among community groups, I think we first have to appreciate that companies perhaps are not naturally as altruistic as community groups. And they clearly have a very tight competitive focus day to day on serving their customers, managing their employees, managing their supply chains, and trying to deliver a profit to their shareholders. That's really where they start. So in looking at the SDG side of things, those are typically very high level calls to action to end poverty and inequality and protect the planet, etc. So a board is typically very focused on its own objectives, and to move that board into a place where it really is considering those higher level objectives is often a difficult thing to do. We're in slightly challenging economic times now, and that tends to be the focus of those boards. So I think if there was an opportunity to introduce more principles or regulation, that would be fantastic. It's not coming really as one thing. It's coming in a series of sort of smaller initiatives, if you like. And I think part of it is the debate within society. I think there's been some very encouraging move within companies, for instance, on diversity and a range of particularly social issues. But I think on some of the harder environmental issues, there is a real challenge because it's often very expensive for a company to actually start to undertake actions that will help solve SDGs. So I think if we look at some of the initiatives that have taken place, this sort of incremental set of steps has to start somewhere. And one of the most encouraging things I think so far has been the European legislation on sustainable disclosure. So in Europe and the UK and increasingly in other countries, both companies and investors are being encouraged to start to measure and disclose some of the externalities, if you like, from a business, the impacts they're having on people and planet. And so those processes, if you like, are designed in the first instance to measure, and therefore working on the principle of what gets measured gets managed. We'll hope to take steps towards being able to achieve greater alignment, because things that, as I was saying earlier on, have previously been hidden now come back into the limelight, and we can all start to appreciate. So I think, there is no question that there is also a prioritization here. If we think about what most people would put first, climate change seems to be a really significant driver in the investment community anyway, and companies are really focusing on that. So that's SDG 13, which aims to take urgent action not only to tackle climate change, but its impacts. And I think, we're making good steps forward on that. But I wish there was one overarching regulation or set of principles. As I say, it's this sort of piecemeal development, but it's heading in the right direction.
Thank you, Henry. So I think you've touched on, climate change and, goal 13, which as we've seen across the investment community, we've seen it, across society, civil society, and through a number of sectors. Goal 13 has resonated, and there's a lot of measurable types of goals that have been put in place. If we think about Paris Agreement, the Paris Agreement, which was agreed around a similar time to the 17 SDGs, there seems to be a bit of a link between the Paris Agreement and Goal 13 of the SDGs. So I'd like to turn it over to Friedrich just to get his thoughts on what that link is and what the integration between the two is.
Thank you, Lydia. Yes, so at the time when the SDGs were being framed, I think countries were very aware that they were heading also for agreement, or at least major negotiations for the Paris Agreement. But even before that, the sense has always been that climate change is very much intertwined and linked to sustainability. Knowing that, in a sense, as much as we isolate and say it's a climate problem, if we step back a little bit, we see the interlinkages between climate impacts and the effect on agriculture, on human settlements. And if we look at these sort of the mitigation side, we know, of course, that certain sectors are very prominent: energy, transport. Transport is linked also to human settlements, to cities, to public transport. It's linked to economic models, subsidies for fossil fuels, our energy systems. So really the mitigation side is really sort of linked up and sort of enmeshed in our economic system. So if we want to tackle climate change, much as we may sometimes say we have a climate policy, in fact, what we should be looking at and are really looking at is a sustainable development policy that has positive climate impacts. And in the process of designing and framing our sustainable development or sustainability policies, we are aware of the synergies and the trade-offs. So trying to have synergies between our overall economic policy and even social policies and climate issues, and at the same time minimizing trade-offs. If we're going to be investing or pitching heavily into heavy industry, there's a trade-off there. So we might need to look more carefully at mitigation in terms of our energy system. So really, the climate issue is deeply, deeply interlinked with the SDGs, and that recognition is there by having Goal 13. And Goal 13, in a sense, is almost a placeholder, because behind Goal 13 is a very well-developed set of international rules, a rule book from the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention on Climate Change, its various protocols, the Paris Agreement. Behind that is a greenhouse gas accounting system internationally, which links to national, so there's a very, very sophisticated system that relates to climate mitigation, especially. So that goal and its targets are almost a stand-in. And in fact, there's a footnote saying that whatever is in SDG 13 is of no prejudice to the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC, recognizing that really the international community gets together to make climate policy under the Framework Convention and its various protocols. So that's sort of a very, very sophisticated set of rules. And as you know, annually we have the COP meetings, Conference of the Parties, which are sort of almost like a legislative or a regulatory meeting for this very, very large rule book of rules on climate change. But in a nutshell, if we want to tackle climate change, we have to see it in the context of the broader sustainable development framework. It needs to be linked. We need to look at the synergies and the trade-offs.
That's interesting when we think about the implementation and all of the integration between Goal 13 and the Paris Agreement. And when we think about civil society, there are different tools that civil society use to measure their alignment with various goals, including climate change. And I'm familiar with the scorecard tool that Ollie's organization works with in terms of measuring different civil society organizations. So I think it would be interesting to hear from Ollie, what the scorecard tool ultimately is used for on a national level, and how does it really assess the SDGs and the UN's annual reporting process?
Thanks again, Lydia. Well, I think what's interesting, again, thinking about your previous question about the links from the SDGs and the Paris Agreement, one of the things that's already been highlighted, I think, there by Friedrich, is that the Paris Agreement, the UNFCCC, has more of a treaty basis that actually allows for more specific measurement and almost a kind of legislation, as Friedrich has said, whereas the SDGs, in spite of their great ambition and their very strong language, they are a voluntary commitment. And so member states are not bound in the same way legally. They cannot be taken to court if they don't deliver on the SDGs. And so that leaves some gaps for accountability, makes it a little bit harder to insist on delivery of the different goals. And it also sometimes makes it harder to compare between what different countries are saying they're doing on the 17 goals. And so the idea of the scorecard was something that we thought was one way to help to try to find a way of providing that accountability and comparability between different countries. And so that's why we, working with a number of other partners from different NGOs and think tanks, came up with this notion that we should have a way of scoring how we see progress on the goals in each country, each of those countries that are presenting a VNR, a voluntary national review, because still quite often, governments may pick and choose the particular goals that they want to report on. They may not report on all of them. And so by using this scorecard methodology, it allows us to try to build up a picture, a comparative picture of how civil society groups see progress on the goals. And behind the scorecard, we've come up with a methodology, as I say, that was informed by practical experience, by different researchers and practitioners in different parts of the world. It looks at elements to do with the governance frameworks in a country, what sort of governance is there for the SDGs. It looks at the link to national development plans, strategies and budgets. So, is a government actually embedding the principles of the SDGs in their national plans and in their budgets? We look at the institutional mandates, so which departments within a government are actually taking the leadership on different goals. We look at practical implementation, so how far are each of these goals actually being delivered at a country level, and also at the local level, so not just the national but also the subnational level. But then we also look, because we're coming more from a kind of public facing point of view, we don't only look at what the government is doing on the goals, we also look at what else is happening in a country to help to deliver the goals. So is there public awareness of the goals? Who's actually talking about the goals at the country level? Are there independent monitoring processes in place? Are academics looking at it? Are different NGOs? Are even accountancy firms potentially? Are they looking at the goals in their work? And then we look also at where is the multi-stakeholder partnership happening in a country. So are there forums that bring together ministries with academics, with communities to actually jointly understand the progress and try to take forward that sort of whole of society type approach? So we look from all those different elements, and we provide a toolkit that helps coalitions in each country to then use that scorecard, apply it in their own context, run a series of meetings. And we're grateful that we have the support from the Swiss government to provide a little bit of resource to help to pay for those meetings. Not a huge amount, but just enough to be able to bring people together at the country level and to have that dialogue with their government, and then to bring those findings to the UN in July. So that's the kind of process that we go through each year. And I think what's been really interesting about it is that we have seen a gradual change from the way governments report. And although there isn't, as I said at the beginning, it is a voluntary commitment, so there's no legal requirement, but still it's interesting that more and more governments now do take this seriously. More and more governments are reporting on all the goals and are actually showing, what's the progress. They want to come to New York, they want to come to the UN and show their progress. So they're feeling a kind of moral obligation from their own citizens and from the public to show that they're actually making progress. So I think that's where this could have a catalytic effect. And we've seen the same thing. I mean, I know colleagues who work on the human rights side in Geneva, and actually some of those human rights commitments are also voluntary, but they've become a moral kind of obligation. And we hope the same thing is beginning to happen with the SDGs.
So it's interesting because when I think about the scorecard that very much civil society and governments are utilizing to align themselves with the SDGs, it reminds me a bit of what ESG ratings on the investment side is attempting to do in terms of getting corporate data related to the ESG framework and trying to formulate a methodology, a score for companies and funds. So Henry, I'd like to turn it back to you. As a fund manager, what company data is currently available to make these more friendly ESG investments? How has it evolved over the last 10 years? And what role do ESG ratings play in interpreting data on funds and companies to build these more impact-focused portfolios?
So it's been a journey, as you said, over 10 years. I think we have to start with the premise that nobody wants to admit that they are causing pollution or there are, worker problems in their supply chain. These are not bits of data that are voluntarily disclosed by many companies. So there's a lot of hard work to do and a lot of extra analysis and research to find out just what is happening inside companies sometimes. And I think that has really been a struggle that ratings have then tried to, or it's caused a void which some rating agencies have tried to fill. And I think there is a big spectrum of different sorts of ratings, some of which are very reliable and helpful when you're trying to build a sustainable portfolio, and others which, in a way, are answering the wrong question. So if I was going to phrase it for you, you could ask the question, what impact will climate change have on my investment? Well, that would be very much a sort of investment, a financially orientated question. But actually, when you're thinking sustainably, what you really want the answer to is the question, what impact does my investment have on climate change? Those subtly different questions generate very different ratings. And so some of the ratings are out there are very much orientated around a sort of financial risk, and some are around the sustainability risk. And I think that's where we've unfortunately seen quite a lot of greenwashing, this phrase you may have heard of, which is when funds or companies typically make exaggerated or misleading claims about their environmental credentials. And so regulators are really now trying to stamp down on this. And I think we'll see a shift in the ratings to be more dependent on data and what is actually happening inside a company rather than an opinion or a risk judgment. And often those risk judgments are relative. So which is the least bad company in the cement sector might be one of the ways a rating is generated. Actually, that doesn't help you in trying to cut the total amount of carbon emissions. So I think that ratings play a role. Ultimately, when we talk about a rating, what we're saying is, where is your bottom line? Where do you draw a line that an investment is no longer sustainable or is not going to be sustainable in the future? And it's a combination of investment risk on the one hand, but also what many underlying investors are asking for, which is they want to make their returns in a way which is not causing significant harm. And therefore, measuring that harm is really, if you like, it's a harm rating, is something that no one would attach to their company or their product. But I think ultimately, when we've got more of the disclosure I was talking about earlier on, that's really where we'll end up. So scorecards, different roles in different places, from Friedrich describing the wider picture of all of the detail and depth behind the goals, Ollie talking about the scorecards in civil society. I think at a company and investment level, it's all about trying to unearth and bring to the fore what the issues are that need to be tackled.
That's interesting, Henry, because I think when we're thinking about measurement and how much have we moved since the launch of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, how are we measuring progress? So clearly, the investment community has moved strongly towards more impact-focused portfolios, looking at it from the framework of ESG. We've heard from Ollie about the scorecard and the regular reporting of civil society and monitoring of governments in its alignment and its achievement towards the SDGs. I'd like to turn it back over to Friedrich. If you can share how the United Nations measures progress towards the delivery of these 17 US Sustainable Development Goals, and what role and significance does this report, which is called the Global Sustainable Development Report, play in this monitoring, if you will?
Thank you, Lydia. And just before I do that, I think the point made by Henry really resonated with me, this idea of looking at risk. Are my investments at risk of climate change vis-a-vis actually saying, does my investment or my make a contribution to the SDGs? I think that's a really critical distinction and, perhaps fairly obvious, but nonetheless very important. And I think I just wanted to highlight that. I think because when we think about moving maybe from ESG towards SDG related investment, really looking at the impact. What is the impact, the positive impact of our investments, and perhaps also the negative, measuring the harm, as Henry said. Now, to the point on the measurement of the SDGs, one thing that also changed is when you move, of course, from a more abstract notion of sustainability, sustainable development as development which preserves the options for future generations, enough for us to develop, which is the classical Brundtland definition. Once we take that and we put that into the framework of goals, we come then, of course, naturally to measurement. And there's been a huge investment within the UN, but also from all member states in actual measurement, especially countries that have weaker statistical capacity have had a lot of support to try and measure those 230 something indicators. So those indicators developed in a technical process with UN agencies, trying to make sure that every target has a suitable indicator, some quite difficult. For instance, on SDG 16, rule of law and peaceful societies, quite difficult methodologically to find suitable indicators, and still some quibbling about whether we have suitable indicators. But a massive investment. What happens is countries report to the United Nations, they deliver their data, it's sort of cleaned, collated, and organized. There is development of these indicators and assistance from the UN system entities. Every indicator has a so-called custodian UN entity, which has developed and worked on the methodology and kind of takes care of supporting its reporting on that indicator. The trouble, of course, is that some of these are very expensive. So census data is expensive, household surveys are expensive, and there's always a time lag. So in the discussions, for instance, now as we look to the SDG summit in 2023, September, is where's the up-to-date data? Where's the latest data? And there's always a discussion. Statisticians are very, very careful, very rigorous, and say this data doesn't meet the standards of statistical validity. But behind the progress reporting is a huge investment that gives member states a way of tracking progress, gives outside parties and others working on scorecards as audited to say, okay, this is where your country stands. You may say this, but the data tells us a different story. So it's a very, very positive development. So that's annually the UN prepares a SDG progress report. Every 4 years, the Global Sustainable Development Report is prepared by an independent group of scientists, and they were appointed by the Secretary General to prepare a scientific input to the SDG summit, which is held every 4 years, to say, where do we stand? What are the sort of a stock take on sustainable development, on the goals, as well as pathways forward. And their second report will be released in a sort of a beta, unedited early advanced version in March, and the final version for the summit in September. But that report really an independent take on where we stand and the way forward. And their message as it's developing at the moment is we can reach the SDGs, we can make it, but we require transformation. Incremental business as usual approaches won't get us there. And they explore the idea of transformation, how systems transform, how policies can be transformative. That's the main message of this GSDR, which is worth taking a look. And they really made an effort to make it accessible and communicable. So it's not written, I think, in the language that's the hard for the ordinary person or interested layperson to understand. They've really tried to make it accessible and reader friendly. Over.
Thanks, Friedrich. I think it's interesting because you touched on as well the SDG summit, and that's taking place in September this year. And that's essentially, marking the midpoint of the implementation of the 2030 SDG agenda, where, it'll bring, together political and, lots of thought leaders in a series of these very high level meetings. Can you touch a little bit, Friedrich, on what we can potentially expect from the SDG summit this year?
So the summit has at the core, because it's a member state organization, we will have a political declaration, and that is the negotiations on that are underway. Ireland and Qatar, their representatives are leading this. So we'll have an outcome document, hopefully ambitious, high level, kind of pointing to the stock taking, pointing to some of the areas of concern. For instance, there's a lot of emphasis at the moment on financing. Countries are saying if we want to close the SDG gap, we need financing. If we want to close the SDG gap, we need to look at the international financial architecture, which means basically the way the IMF and the World Bank and the multilateral development banks at the regional level make loans, that their risk assessment. So there needs to be some adjustment at the level of these institutions dealing with global finance. That's a longer term discussion, but some countries hope we'll have a signal to say we need to fix this. The fix is in Washington, not here in New York, but it needs to be tackled. But around that, that's the intergovernmental part, but around that is really this mobilization, as you said, also of thought leaders of the private sector. So we're working with partners trying to energize them and get them excited, not just about yet another UN summit, but what are the issues here? You know, the issues that matter to the corporate sector, how they can get involved, how they can become more rigorous in their reporting, to bring the civil society in. There's talk of having a people summit around the meeting, to really realizing that, yep, at the core is this governmental part, but to make a difference, we need to bring in the other stakeholders, because as Ollie mentioned, one characteristic of the SDGs, much as they're voluntary, they're also a much broader tent. We've really said, okay, we need, and we recognize that all those stakeholders need to be part of it. It might be a bit of a higgledy-piggledy mess sometimes, but it's not just a member states, they can't make it on their own. You know, it's a realization that we need to bring and find niches and hooks to bring all the other partners. And the summit will hopefully be a way of also doing that, generating that excitement and recommitment for the goals.
Thank you. Thank you, Frederick. It certainly will be, you know, quite a pivotal summit, the midpoint. So if we take a step back, looking again now, you know, more at the framework of the SDG and ESG, so bringing together the investment community and other aspects of society, going back to Ollie, how do you think, from a civil society perspective, this framework of ESG and SDG is working for corporates?
Well, so this is probably the trickiest question that you put to me. I mean, I think there are different elements here, and first of all, if I can just quickly recap what I'd said before, a lot of the work that we've been doing so far has been focused around what governments are doing. The scorecard, as I described it, mainly is around looking at what actions have been taken by governments to deliver on the SDGs. And we ultimately are scoring, once we've done those consultations that I described before, we come up with a score of, well, it starts at -5 if there's backsliding, up to +5 on each of the goals. And the idea is that that's helpful in terms of the dialogue we have with governments. And that's been a lot of what we've focused on in these last few years, because I guess the primary focus was to try to encourage and you know, catalyze the discussions at the national level so that governments themselves would step forward. Having said that, I think now we recognize as civil society that actually, you know, governments are not the only actors here, and clearly the private sector has a very big role to play. And I think for us as kind of, you know, civil society groups, charities, NGOs, community groups, a lot of the expertise and the insights that those groups can bring could also potentially in the future provide useful insights for wider investments, for corporate investments as well. And I think one of the things that we haven't really explored yet, and we'd love to explore this over the coming months, is how can we bring some of that insight of local communities, for example, living in the Amazon, or local communities living in Ghana or Togo? What is their experience also of the types of investments that are coming into their country? Is it genuinely having an impact? We might be able to help to uncover some of those points that Henry mentioned about potential greenwashing. You know, a chocolate company that says they're very good in Togo and they're supporting local communities. So we might be able to go to those communities and get a real sense of, is that actually the case? Is that change happening? Has the company genuinely involved that community? Is there a kind of an ethical policy in place within the country? So those might be some of the things that we could explore together in the future. And I think, you know, that might also give consumers more confidence that when they see something says, yes, it's helping the producers in the rainforest, or it's protecting a particular ecosystem, then that is actually genuinely happening, and that we've got the evidence to show that that is happening. So that might be an area I think that could be explored going forward. And I could also see that from the point of view of communities, there is, of course, a desire and a demand for greater partnership working. We've heard that one of the big gaps for the SDGs is lack of investment still. And so many communities are finding it harder and harder, and many governments themselves are having to squeeze their budgets as well. And so in order to really effect the changes that we need, there does need to be investment. And we know that many of the investment groups and corporates may well be able to play a key role in that. And I think that will be one of the focus areas on the SDG summit this September. I've been reading up some of the initial notes from the Secretary General at the UN, and he's already calling for a pledge for an SDG stimulus package of some 500 billion, I think. So this is something that might start to creep up the agenda. And of course, that can't be done without the likes of the investment houses that many of you will be familiar with. So I think there's some potential there to galvanize a broader financing package over the coming months.
Now, Ollie, when you talk about corporates and the role that they play, and obviously, there's a need for the transfer of funds to support certain SDG initiatives. What I'd like to do is have Henry's opinion on this. When you're looking at investing in corporates and you're looking at the reporting and the investment strategy, the corporate strategy that a lot of these corporates are putting into play in terms of trying to align themselves with ESG and ultimately with the SDGs, are corporates making large strides towards sustainable policies? Or are they still doing too little to support the SDGs? What are your thoughts on that, Henry?
I would love to put on some rose-tinted glasses and say, yes, corporates are making large strides, and they've put on a sort of altruistic mindset. Unfortunately, as I said earlier on, I think their focus is very, very clearly on profit maximization. And unless, as Ollie was describing, you can create really big government stimulus, which will get companies to invest in the right direction. We've just seen that in the US with the Inflation Reduction Act, badly named act, because it's really all about, funding sustainability initiatives, particularly renewable energy initiatives. And, buried within it are lots of complexity, but ultimately it's creating financial incentives for companies to behave in a different way. Remember that companies are also very concerned about sustaining the profits they already have. And I thought what Friedrich was saying earlier on about the scientists' report for the upcoming SDG conference, where they're saying, well, it is possible for us to achieve the SDGs, but it needs enormous transformation. Well, transformation is a scary word for many corporates, because that means disruption to the profit stream they've been used to earning. And they really don't like that. So I think trying to encourage companies to make large strides needs, if you like, a supply side incentive. If you try and restrict their activities or you tax their activities, that typically is very unpopular. But if you give them an incentive to move in a different direction, then they may well respond. And that's broadly what we're seeing today. I think one has to be careful how much you incentivize, because it can have, the wrong consequences. But nonetheless, I don't think that it's going to be very easy to regulate our way to the SDGs. So it's going to have to be a combination, I think, ultimately of carrot and stick to get that large move.
Thank you, Henry. And I think turning it back to you, Friedrich, regarding the UN perspective on the state of the sustainability picture. It's not all rosy as Henry pointed out, and at times it can be gloomy. Do you have any views on what the positive developments are and some of the green shoots out there from your perspective?
Thank you, Lydia. Yes, and just I really liked Henry's point and really an analysis on this issue of change. I mean, transformation, change implies loss for somebody, disruption. And it's great to say it, and I think his insight that there's an upside and a downside, and the downside actors or constituencies will fight very hard to block that. And I think one of the things which we heard from this Inflation Reduction Act here is it's not that efficient economically. So economists would prefer taxes. But in actual fact, sometimes opening the money spigot and letting the money flow gets things going. And if you can afford to do that in such a society as this one, it gets things moving. But that just as an aside, so I really like that analysis. Now, yes, on the gloomy side, I mean, if you open our SDG progress report, it's really the picture that doesn't look very good. So yet we know we have made progress since 2015. We have made progress, even if we seem to be falling short. So to think a little bit about that, one thing I see, for instance, is on electric vehicles. I looked back at the numbers. In 2018, there were about 5 million electric vehicles, total stock of electric vehicles in the world. Last year, or this year, we're on track to have 13 million electric vehicles sold out of 66 million estimated passenger vehicles. So a huge growth. Questions about where the minerals will come from, questions about other bits, but that's just a massive, massive change. Things in agriculture where people are, retailers are getting back into the supply chain, saying you need to apply regenerative agriculture. So really trapping carbon in the soil, using some of these standards like the Global Reporting Initiative and others to track that. Is it enough? Is it going to, dig into that profit motive? Maybe not. But if we have voluntary commitments, which correctly, as Ollie said, much of this is voluntary, but if we put this in the framework of reporting, then it changes. If I can get away with saying I made a promise and no one checks, that's no good. But if I made a promise and I'm asked to check, even just for internal reasons or to report to my shareholders, then things really change. And if that moves across, for instance, 50,000 EU companies that will be applying this corporate sustainability directive, if they have to report according to a EU guideline, that's a huge change. And that's 430 million person market. And the last thing I want to say on the energy transition, we are seeing in developing countries like the country I'm from, South Africa, 90% coal-fired electricity. But we see the international community coming and saying, we're going to give you loans and grants to make this transition, to kind of kickstart your move from coal to renewable energy. And the same thing is happening in Indonesia and some other large developing countries. So there is the sort of the seed funding and capital to make that just transition. And last point on that is not just the technology, but also the people. Because as much as the disruption and change is technological and for companies, it's also for people. If you're a coal miner, if you are a assembler of motor vehicles, gasoline-powered vehicles, the electric vehicles are a threat, solar power. So we need to think about that social dimension, retraining, shifting people from one part to new industries that are growing up, and sort of easing that transition, making sure it's also in a sustainable transition, but also a socially just transition. Thank you.
So we're coming up now close to the time for this webinar, but before we close, I wanted to ask each of you one question, and if you can give me a quick, short answer in terms of over the next 12 months, from your perspective, what do you think is the key focus that will have the biggest impact if we focus on it this year to help become much closer to the progress of the SDGs? Henry, over to you. What are your thoughts?
So my really big call to action would be to shareholders, because the governance chain at the moment is broken. What we're hearing from many retail investors is that they would like to be much more sustainable. They would like the companies they invest in to be more sustainable. But by the time that has gone through the agents of their fund manager and ultimately to the vote that they have at an AGM to, if necessary, fire the directors. If the directors are not running the company the way the owners of the company want it run, then they can change things. So I think, what we're seeing is that in wider society, there's a much greater appetite for change than is actually being reflected in the way the companies are being managed. And the companies, ultimately, those directors must remember who their ultimate boss is. And the boss, the shareholders, are not quite getting their views heard in the boardroom. So that's the really big change I'd like to see is fund managers actually use the votes that their clients have given them to actually really begin to reflect this sustainability trend that everyone would like to see.
Thank you, Henry. Friedrich, what would be your key action, call to action for the next 12 months?
Thank you. I'm going to piggyback on Henry's idea, which I like very much, is that if we have shareholders as the owners of companies, if we look to citizens and populations, they are the stakeholders in countries and member states. Let's ask our politicians and our leaders to really listen to the concerns and bring them to the table and take some risks. So listen to your populations, come to the UN, come to regional meetings and national parliaments, take some risks and make the change that everyone knows we need to do.
Thank you, Friedrich. And Ollie, over to you. Call to action next 12 months.
Thank you. Well, I think I can build further on what Friedrich has highlighted, and I would go right down to the local level. So, we've heard from the macro discussions, we've heard from the national government decisions, but for me, the change has to come to the local level now. It's really about empowering communities to be able to step up and take action. And the thing that we've really noticed in our work is that the budgets do not have to be huge. Even small budgets, if they're well targeted, if they reach communities directly, they can have a really huge impact. And we've seen, for example, in the Amazon in Brazil, small budgets going direct to indigenous peoples can have a catalytic effect. The same in Togo with women farmers, the same in Indonesia with youth networks. Getting the budgets to those who are already making the change, helping them to amplify and build their impact. I think that's the way that we can really make the change that we've been calling for since 2015.
Thank you. So thank you all. I wanted to thank all of the panelists for their time today and for their commitment to sharing their opinions. That essentially concludes all the time that we have today. It's been such an interesting topic, yet we've really only had time to scratch the surface. Luckily, we have the opportunity to keep digging deeper into these topics throughout the series. And in the next webinar, we'll look to dig a little bit deeper into the environmental pillar of sustainability, bringing forward fresh insights from another panel of experts. So thank you to all of those who joined us in this inaugural webinar on building bridges for sustainable change. We do encourage you to share your feedback with us so that we can continue to tackle the topics that are of interest to you. But otherwise, we look forward to welcoming you back on our next webinar. So thank you for joining.
Thank you.